everybody for coming. I'm Tom Lucy, and I'm going to talk a little about leading AI adoption. I'll try to keep it kind of at a high level, but if you're interested in this topic further than what I talk about today, I recommend you read the paper. There's a lot of good, especially real-world examples in the paper that I won't be talking about today. So to dive in, I'm going to talk about kind of an overview of my thinking in the narrative, in the context here, and then I'm going to move through four kind of phases of leading AI adoption that I'll kind of go through in more detail. So first, kind of my narrative, the premise of what I'm thinking here. So most companies want to use AI, but many don't know how to get there. I think there's a lot of statistics showing that since the launch of ChatGPT and some other generative AI tools, companies have been talking about AI way more than they have before. Particularly shareholders and analysts see it as something that companies need to be investing in. So I think some compelling statistics are 95% of board directors of publicly traded companies believe that AI will help their business and it's something you should be investing in. More than 70% of CEOs are investing in AI as a result. And if you look at S&P 500 earning calls over a 2-year span, Q1 FY22 to Q through FY23, the number of mentions of AI on those calls in aggregate went from 500 to 30,000. So everybody's talking about it, but there's still a lot of work to be done to actually use it. So I think the important thing to remember about AI is it's a tool. It's a tool you can use to solve business problems. But since there's all this hype around AI and every company wants to use it, we're really starting with a solution-first approach here. Companies are saying, we need to use AI. We don't necessarily have a problem in mind, but we know that it can help our business is kind of the way they're talking about it. So ultimately, the way that goes into an organization is the executive leadership will delegate the task of figuring out how do we use AI to some lower level leader within the organization or set of leaders. So that's really my audience for this presentation. I'm trying to put myself in that lower level leader's shoes and say, okay, I'm being told I have to create business value with AI. How can I do it successfully? So we know that these overall, in general, we know solution-first approaches are generally suboptimal means of creating value. And rather, leaders should be figuring out what their problems are and then figuring out the right solution for those problems. So in a world where you have to use AI, I think there's 4 key phases that I'm going to talk through for reframing the solution-first mandate into being successful with a value-creating initiative. So those are ideation, technology selection, experimentation, and prioritization. So I'll get into each of those in more detail now. So first on ideation. Ideation is important because companies have finite resources. Can't invest in everything. And you also need to know what are the good things to invest in. So with the solution-first approach, the pressure is on finding a problem to solve. But really, what leaders need to do if they want to be successful is find a good problem to solve. So I think there's 2 main things that leaders can consider when doing this. The first is taking a bottom-up approach to ideation as opposed to a top-down approach. So rather than looking to senior leadership and saying, this is the problem we want to solve. Look at speak to your individual contributors and frontline workers and customers, all across your organization and find out what are the problems that are salient to them and affect their day-to-day work. And then second, consider revisiting persistent problems. So AI is a very complex and expensive tool. And so it's not going to be the right solution for many problems that businesses face. But problems that it might be a good solution for are those the business has failed to solve in the past. So if previous attempts have been insufficient, it might warrant the investment and complexity of AI to solve that problem. The next phase is technology selection. So I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that while Gen AI may have kind of spurred on this recent hype about it, it's far from the only AI approach or methodology. AI has been around for, I think, about 70 years. And so there's a tremendous amount of methods and algorithms that fall into that category. So I think the first thing to consider for leaders to consider is whether the problem they're looking to solve is analytical or creative, because that will kind of bucket the approaches that they need to pursue. So a creative problem, for example, might have been coming up with the graphics for this presentation. So I used Gen AI for that because I needed kind of a creative solution. Versus an analytical problem might be one where you're looking to like optimize something, like figuring out what's the best bus route for my bus to take around town. And in that case, you might not want to just ask ChatGPT. You might want to take a more rigorous statistical approach to solving that problem. The second thing is involving your technical stakeholders. So technical stakeholders both will be the ones you're ultimately depending on to execute on your solution, and they're also ones that may, like within your organization today, they may have the most knowledge about AI and what it can do. So rather than just delegating to them the execution phase, it's important to partner with them throughout the process. And then third is acceptable risk. So with any problem you're trying to solve, there'll be an acceptable risk in the solution. And AI is very different from past software approaches because the output can often be like non-deterministic. You don't exactly know what you're going to get at the end. I'm sure all of us have the experience of asking ChatGPT the same question twice and getting a different answer both times. So if your problem is something like medical diagnosis, there may be a much higher risk to giving a bad prediction than there would be to something like if you're a graphic designer trying to ideate around like possible images for products. So I think on technology selection, those are three things that leaders need to make sure they're considering. Next, on experimentation, as I mentioned earlier, AI is a very high-cost solution to solving problems. And so before actually honing in on what you want to do and what problem you want to solve, it's important to kind of prototype and gain information about your proposed solution and the business problem you're solving. So the first thing to consider is empowering all employees to participate. Especially right now where there's a lot of hype around it, AI is something that a lot of people are interested in. And throughout your organization, there will be far more than just kind of like your technical experts that are capable of experimenting on problems. Because with the accessibility of things like ChatGPT, experimentation may just be logging onto a web UI and putting in some prompts and seeing what you get back and seeing if it helps your process in your daily function. So important there is thinking about what is your organization's level of expertise? Like what's the vocabulary that people are familiar with? What are the tools that they're comfortable using, and seeing how can you level that up to get organization-wide experimentation. And then second is utilizing tiger teams. So tiger teams are generally kind of small project teams that are spun up particularly to focus on developing prototypes and experimenting explicitly. So this is an approach that from talking with people in the industry, I found recommended rather than say taking a team that has to maintain a product that's already on the market and giving them like a day a week to experiment with AI. Like make a dedicated team that can continuously, sequentially run experiments in this space. And then finally, I want to talk about prioritization. After you've gone through all of these other phases, you'll eventually get to the point where you've got a lot of ideas about problems to solve. You've got experiments that you've run on them. But as I said at the very beginning, an organization's resources are finite. And so ultimately, you need to narrow it down to what are the few projects that we're going to pursue in the short term. So in narrowing down this field, I have two pieces of advice that leaders should consider. The first is process evolution. So with this, AI can be a new thing to a lot of people. It can be a new thing to a lot of organizations. But many organizations are already doing things that AI can help with. So by process evolution, I mean look at what the functions people in your organization are doing today, and where is AI a logical next step in technological evolution. So an example to use there would be going back to graphic design. If your designers right now are using software to generate kind of their design concepts, it's not so big of a jump to have them use an AI-enabled software product that can, fill in parts of the design for them, or they make a design and it comes up with 10 similar options. And then second is requiring result-oriented business cases. So in a lot of organizations, AI can be kind of fluffy in terms of the results that fluffy or fuzzy in terms of the results they expect it to deliver. People can say, well, isn't this so cool? We can do this now. We couldn't do it before. But it's important to really push on what is the ROI of an effort like this, because especially when you're an organization that hasn't implemented AI before and you're trying to develop a new function, it's important to get a success and actually be able to deliver on the value that you set out to deliver on. So with this, thinking about taking all of your options and requiring a business case for each of them, you can really narrow it down to for which ones does a business case exist and for which ones is it hard to put into words the value. And when you're looking to prioritize what should you do first, I would say focusing on the ones where the value can be clearly communicated before execution begins. So with that, that's kind of like the high-level overview of my project, and I'll open it up for questions. Yeah, right on.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm wondering if you found any information about what's the percentage of companies that are prepared for implementing AI? With this, I mean, how many companies have these technical stakeholders or technical experts that can effectively implement AI solutions?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I can't say that I have any statistics around it. I hesitate to assume either. My bet from talking to people in the industry would be that more companies would outwardly say they are prepared to do this than would be in reality. But at the same time, I think that many companies certainly can get there just because, well, while implementing AI is kind of always going to be a technical challenge, there's a whole range of options that companies can use. AI talent is scarce, but you don't necessarily need to have it in-house to incorporate AI into your product. There's a lot of classic consulting firms, but then also kind of like AI-specific shops that have been in existence for a little while or are starting up now, that their whole business is helping companies drive forward and execute on these initiatives.
Thanks.
Amna?
Thanks for the presentation, Tom. A question I had is I was wondering for your research and interviews, if you would come across companies talking about getting stuck in the pilot phase. I bet it's very common where they'll have a business case, they'll have clear metrics for ROI, but then they still get stuck in the pilot phase and can't commit. Just wondering what you've seen on that.
Yeah, I think I saw a ton of that. That's what I heard from basically everybody who I asked about it. And so that's where I think it's really important to make the jump from that experimentation to that prioritization phase. To really, and organizations can do that sometimes, from what I've heard, by setting a time period, saying we're going to spend the next 6 months, the next year experimenting, and we're going to set ourselves a deadline that by the end of that year, we're going to select 3 projects to invest in, and we're going to kill all the others. So we're going to put them on the shelf and figure we'll come back to those later. So I think that's really the key for organizations. They have to be willing to commit to that and actually do it, because you'll always, if you kind of empower the whole organization to experiment on things, one kind of negative consequence you can have from that is a whole lot of pet projects and people who have emotional connection to that solution and that project throughout your organization, and you have to have leadership that's willing to kind of focus priority and make concrete investment decisions. Thanks, everyone.